Record. There we go. Now we're recording that. And so we'll introduce Tenino City historian Rich Edwards. He's been the Tenino City historian since 2018 and is a member of the Washington State Historical Society, the South Thurston Historical Society, and serves as a volunteer docent, I'm sure a decent docent, at the Tenino Depot Museum. After months of a lot of research, he has done well, he put out a book, and that's what we're going to focus on. That's the naming of Tenino, because there's a lot of controversy among historians about the naming of Tenino. But he also holds a, let's see, what did I say, a Bachelor of Arts degree from WSU and a Master of Librarianship from the University of Washington, and he's a retiree from the Washington State Library. And he has a good connection to Tumwater, too. His dad used to be a Tumwater policeman, and he's still doing well. Curly Edwards, I got to interview him and it was just great. So it's nice to have that connection to Tumwater too. But again, the topic of this presentation comes from his book. It's, in fact, let me hold it up. Can I do that? Well, oops. No,
it should be the opening screen of the
well, yeah, okay, there we go.
Presentation too.
Good, okay. All right, so there we go. So let me just turn it all over here to Rich Edwards. Rich, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Don. As Don said, my name's Rich Edwards. I actually grew up in Tenino in the 1950s and 60s, and then my family moved to Tumwater, where my dad was a city policeman. And so I have a lot of roots in Thurston County and in Tenino. So when I retired in 2010 from the Washington State Library, I wanted to focus more on my work as a historian, and I went back to my hometown, Tenino, to work there as a docent at the museum. And in 2018, when they made me city historian, I looked to see, well, what big questions could I research? What work could I do as a historian for the city of Tenino? And so the biggest unanswered question that every historian that's written about Tenino has said is you can't have a book about Tenino without visiting the dispute over how Tenino got its name. It's been a debate for over a century, and it was the big unanswered question. And MacArthur and Dwelly, who both wrote local history books, addressed it, came away with no answer. And so I decided to tackle it. So I spent quite a bit of time and process, and the result was I wrote a book, The Naming of Tenino, which is available freely on PDF through the City of Tenino website, as well as print copies are available at the Tenino Depot Museum. So my process was I started with a literature review, reading everything that I could find about the history of the name of Tenino. I read all the local historians' work and all the articles in Pacific Northwest magazines and newspapers. I did a lot of newspaper research. The Washington State Library is great for that. And in the process of the literature review, there are two main theories that surfaced. Are you seeing the slides okay, Don? Okay. So yeah, there's been dispute, as you can see from this article from the Coast magazine in 1909. They were already debating the origin of the name of Tenino, and that there was some dispute. And this shows the two main theories. Some say it's an Indian name. In this case, he says meaning the meeting of ways. Others say that it was a railroad terminal designated by a number 1090 or 1090, or some sources say T90. And those two theories, that it's either a local Native American name or it's a railroad marker designation or a locomotive number, those have been the two big theories that were floated throughout over a century of discussing its name. It got to be such a debate that in 1949, it was actually published in Ripley's Believe It or Not nationally. As you can see on the left there, it says T90. The town of Tenino, Washington got its name from markings on a surveyor's stake. So it became this big mystery about how Tenino got its name. When I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in Tenino, it was commonly said that it was a railroad numbering, and it was related to the locomotive number that came into town. And so that's what I heard growing up as a kid. So one of the earliest examples of the theories quoted is by Meany in his 1923 book, Washington Geographic Names, which is like one of the early tomes on references about geographic names. And he said that most railroad men claim that the town derived its name in numbering from the survey station, where it was numbered 1090. And he had heard it disputed even in 1923. And so almost as soon as this discussion got underway, these theories were also debunked. And so it continued to be this discussion for over a century because there was no evidence or proof. And in fact, there was counter evidence to both theories. And so it just became this ongoing debate. They were disproved for the most part in the early part of the 20th century. The Northern Pacific Railroad was consulted by many local historians, and they all said, yeah, it's just not true. I have here a quote from John Mickelson at the engineering department at the Northern Pacific Railroad from 1942 saying it's not correct, as neither the location nor construction station 1090 was at this point. And they've claimed it's a locomotive number, but no such numbers were assigned in the early days. So it just isn't true. And yet it continued to be told as the way in which Tenino got its name, even up until I started researching the book in 2018. The other, of course, is that it's a Native American term. And this is from William Prosser in 1903. William Prosser is interesting because he was a politician from Tennessee who came out to the Northwest. So what made him think that he could write a book on the history of Puget Sound and be an authority on Chinook jargon? I don't know. But he stated that it was an Indian word signifying junction, because there were two trails that met. There was a junction of the trails in the Scatter Creek Valley area. I'm going to call that area by a couple different names. One of them is going to be Scatter Creek Valley, because part of the Scatter Creek Valley is where Tenino is. Tenino's in that valley. And then he mentions it's near the farms of Hodgson, which is misspelled, it's Hodgdon, and Davenport. And so the old Hudson's Bay Trail used to run from Yelm Prairie through the Scatter Creek Valley area and then southward to the Cowlitz farms, and then farther on to Fort Vancouver. And so that was the Hudson's Bay Trail. And then the Simmons party cut their trail up to Tumwater and then to Olympia. That trail branched off the Hudson's Bay Trail where Tenino is today. And so that's the junction of the trails. He mentions in this statement that in Chinook jargon, the fork is called a Tenino. So that's, I think, the earliest statement that this is the source of that name I could find. However, the local natives are the Nisqually, and they called it Clapa-Atum. So there's not Tenino. So, and this is from 1895. It actually predates Prosser's statement. So, then we see a statement in 1935 in a series of articles on the naming of Tenino that appeared in the Thurston County Independent, that there's a letter from E.H. Thomas, which is quoted, saying it's not jargon, it's not from the old Chinook language, and Thomas was considered the authority on the Chinook jargon and the Chinook language of his generation. And so, again, there are two main theories. It's a railroad numbering, and it's a Chinook jargon word, both of which are quickly disproved and yet continue to resurface because there's no other theory that makes sense to anybody. So those are the two noted theories that arose during my research. However, historians did actually mention a couple other uses of the word Tenino. For one, it's used to designate a band of Shahoptian Indians in the Deschutes Valley. And that was the Tenino band of Walla Walla. And they lived between the Deschutes and Celilo Falls, and on the south side of the Columbia River. It was noted that they existed by historians. However, they live hundreds of miles away from the Scatter Creek Valley. There's no known connection between that band and this location. So it's often noted that, hey, they use the same name, but there's no connection, so it can't probably be the source. The other use of the name Tenino is that there was a steamboat operating on the Columbia River, owned by the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, called the Tenino. But that steamboat also operated on the upper Columbia above the Celilo Falls, up through to Wallula and up the Snake River as far as Idaho. So again, there's a use of the name Tenino, and both those uses predate the naming of the town of Tenino, but they're not any relationship. They're hundreds of miles away, and so they're always noted by historians, but they're not evidence or of a theory of naming. So that left me with those four things when I started my research. Is there's two really well-liked theories, both of which are disproved, and then two other elements, neither of which have any connection. So I started doing some research. This particular slide was when I was down at the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Oregon. I did research here in Washington, I did research in Oregon, and I also worked with the Minnesota Historical Society, who has the archives for the Northern Pacific Railroad. I started looking then, going back, what do we know about the name Tenino? When was it first used? Where did it come from? So in 1906, the city of Tenino was incorporated. So I mean, it's on record, 1906, city of Tenino. So then, when was the town that predates it? Because that's where the name came from. Tenino was a term used for the town there for decades before that. So according to newspapers. So I went to the Thurston County Auditor's Office and got the plat mats, and the town was platted in 1873. So here's the plan of the town of Tenino from 1873. So we know that the name Tenino was used at least then, as far back as 1873. In fact, in the summer of 1873, there were two plats filed. One, this one, was from the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company, which was the land subsidiary of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Their job was to sell the land that the railroad was gaining by building track and turning it into new towns where they could sell lots. And so they platted this plan of Tenino in 1873. And Hodgdon, who was the nearest farmer to this area where the trails met, he was also running a stage stop there. And he owned the land north of the line as part of a donation land claim. So he filed a addition to the plan of Tenino, which then created lots on his half of the line. So that's how the town of Tenino got started. Let's see here. I got lost for a second. So this shows from the survey maps from the donation land claim period. This is from the 1850s, late 1850s. Hodgdon, also misspelled again. His name is never spelled correctly. In fact, I've seen even him spell it two ways. And as you can see, the Scatter Creek runs just north of his property. Actually, his land claim ran over that creek, north of the creek. Chain Hill is north of the creek. And then south, on the southwest corner, you see Davenport's farm. He had a donation land claim in that area too. And those two farmers were those donation claims that become what is the city limits of Tenino today. And on the south end of the map, down where Davenport's area is, you can see the hillside on the south end. And so that's the little valley area between Scatter Creek, Chain Hill to the north, and then that's now Blumar Hill on the south side. And you can see where the trail from the Hudson's Bay Company running off to the right, off to the east, that was the Hudson's Bay Trail that goes out to Yelm Prairie. And then it comes and cuts through, meets up with the trail that branches just south of Davenport's. That's the trail, the Simmons Trail, that goes up to Tumwater and goes up across Scatter Creek. So what was this called earlier than 1873 when it became the town of Tenino? And I found that in 1860, it had started to be called Coal Bank because there was coal fields that were found south of Scatter Creek Valley between there and the Skookumchuck. And so those coal fields became the source of the name for the region. So there was no name for that area of Scatter Creek Valley where Hodgdon lived. It was where Hodgdon lived. It was his farm. And Davenport had a place there. And then all the other pioneering families of the area, the Colvins and the Tillys were farther out. There's a whole group of families up the Scatter Creek, or not, Skookumchuck Valley. They're all kind of banded together under this generic Coal Bank regional name. And so the post office was established in 1860 at the home of Stephen Hodgdon, and it was renamed in 1873 when they platted the town. So we know then that somewhere between 1860 and 1873, the name changed. So we're trying to narrow in. My research was trying to narrow in on when and where did this change happen, and then who made it and why. So, in the 1870 United States Census, it's still called Coal Bank as well. So, it was called Coal Bank for a length of time there, over a decade, and it was well noted. It was written in the newspapers as Coal Bank. And so it seems very strange that there's suddenly this new name, and it occurs sometime between 1870 and 1873. And if you know the history of the area, then the big thing that happens in that time window of a couple of years is the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad. So that became the focus of my next research. This is the survey map from 1872 of that Scatter Creek Valley area. And you can see at the top, the blue line is Scatter Creek, and you can see S. Hodgdon's farm. And it mentions that it's a stage station, and it's on a fork of the trail, and the trail drops down, meets with the Hudson's Bay Trail, which then drops down and runs farther south. So this is the state of the area in 1872 as the railroad has done the survey and is beginning to build their line. So we got to talk a little about the Northern Pacific Railroad. So it was chartered in 1864 to create a transcontinental line from Minnesota to the Pacific Northwest, specifically to Puget Sound. Construction began in 1870 in the Great Lakes region, coming west. In 1871, they decided that they were trying to make some money off of their rail line because they were a business, and they decided to start building a line in the west. And they decided that the center of population in the Puget Sound area was in Southwest Washington, Puget Sound in Southwest Washington. So they picked a point on the Columbia River and bought the land and started the city of Kalama as their base. And then they drove north from there up to Puget Sound. That was their plan. So in 1871, they built Kalama and started driving a line up. And then in 1872, the line was completed up to Hodgdon's Station, as is mentioned in many of the newspapers. However, by the 1st of November, 1872, as can be seen in this freight listing for merchandise on those stations, the bottom station is named Tenino. So it was named Tenino by at least the 1st of November in 1872, even though it's not platted till 1873. However, all the newspaper write-ups throughout 1872 leading up to this, it's Hodgdon's or Coalbank. So I'm still trying to sort through, well, where did this name come from? So I finally found what I think is the first use of Tenino in the press. Comes from the Puget Sound Daily Courier, October 18, 1872. There's a new town at the end of the railroad track, and it is called by the euphonious name Tenino, because apparently they didn't know how it was spelled either, because it had never been used before. Either that or their type has a broken piece there, but I don't think so. It looks different enough from the E. I think it's just a misspelling, because nobody had ever used it before. On the next day, the Kalama Beacon, which was the newspaper of the Northern Pacific Railroad, they pretty much ran that newspaper out of Kalama, and it was always full of railroad news. And that's the likely source for newspapers for getting the name. The Kalama Beacon said the cars now run daily to Tenino. Hodgdon's. They had to add Hodgdon's because nobody knew what Tenino was. Leaving Kalama at 6:30 and reaching the end of the track about noon. One thing I want to point out is that these are the earliest mentions at this point I can find about the use of Tenino. It is not a number. It is not a contraction. It is the name Tenino. So more evidence that it isn't related to some sort of mnemonic or abbreviation that morphs into a name. So then I'm concentrating now on the first half of October, trying to track down where this name comes from. Because everything from September earlier, it's Hodgdon's this and Hodgdon's that and Coalbank. There's nothing about Tenino. And then by mid-October, they're changing it to Tenino. Well, one of the things that happens is on October the 1st, 1872, this gentleman, William Cass, becomes, or George Washington Cass, excuse me, becomes president of the Northern Pacific Railway Company, replacing Smith. His first act is to take a group of directors of the company and staff of the company and do a Pacific Division tour. So they arrive in the Pacific Northwest on October 1st, the very date that he becomes president. And he brings with him a stellar crew, including Frederick Billings and B.P. Cheney and William Howard Ogden, General Sprague, and John Ainsworth, Captain Ainsworth. And they arrive in Kalama, where they then get on the train, because the train had been built from 1871. They start in Kalama, and they had gotten up as far as the Cowlitz River, but the Cowlitz River crossing, the trestle there was proving to be an issue. So they were having trouble with that trestle. Montgomery had been given the contract to make the track northward from Kalama. Hallett had been given a contract to make the track from Hodgdon's south, where they would meet. And so they were working on those tracks both in 1872. So when the board of directors took the cars northward from Kalama, the locomotive engineer, Mr. Riley, gave them a lively ride at the rate of 40 miles an hour, all the way to Olakwa. Pumphrey's. Again, the railroad is changing the name of their stops, and they have to put previous names in parentheses to explain it, because the railroad is creating new stops, and they're trying to create a new name and a new identity for them as well. So the 40-mile ride only went as far as Olakwa, where then they had to cross and take a stage, or actually wagons. They hired coaches, and those coaches then took them to Olympia. From Olympia, they got on board the North Pacific, a steamboat that operated on Puget Sound, because the committee was there to try to not only view the new line they were creating for the Pacific Division, but to also view what could happen when they got to Puget Sound and where they were going to make their base. They were looking for a port to go to with the line where they could then connect in a meaningful and monetarily successful way with Puget Sound. So on board the boat for a couple days, They went to Victoria, BC, and then they viewed the ports at Olympia, Port Gamble, Port Townsend, Bellingham, Mukilteo, Tacoma, and Seattle, trying to find where they wanted to make that final terminal. Their goal, as they stated, was to start building at the nearest to Kalama point on the Sound, because it costs money to drive a track. So they wanted to make it as short a track as they could, which would tend to favor Olympia because it's the southernmost city on the Sound, but where they could find a good harbor with good shore facilities, and I think probably most importantly, plenty of cheap land. Because remember, when they're building track, they get to claim land that's unclaimed. But many of these places that they were looking at for harbors were already built up. Land was very expensive there. And so going into those ports and having to buy expensive land to create some sort of port area was not going to be cheap. So that was their goal when they did their tour. I got lost again. So on October the 5th, they were back in Kalama, where they had a meeting, and they told their general engineer to construct the 66th mile north of Kalama, as will carry the road to a suitable site for the creation of a turntable and necessary temporary buildings to accommodate business for the next 12 months. In October 1872, the railroad was already under some financial strain, and they wanted to open this line and start charging as soon as possible. They weren't sure where they were going to make their port on Puget Sound. So they got as far as Hodgdon's, but at 65 miles, which was the contracted amount of line they built, it dropped a mile south of Hodgdon's junction of trails. So they decided to build one more mile, the 66th mile, till they could get to where the trail junction was in the Scatter Creek Valley. And when they got to that junction, then they would build a turntable so they could operate the line from Tenino to Kalama and at least start making some money before they picked a final destination and then spent the time building the line there. So that was the plan as of October 5th. So here's the map. What they did was the 65th line ends at the bottom where you can see the red line is the rail line, and the end of portage was the 65th line. And as you can see, the survey mark there is 3250, not 1090. And that line, they build another mile, and it curves up and around what is now Blue Mar Hill, and they built their stop just south of that junction. That was the extra 66th mile. I got to talk now about the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, because on the 7th to 10th of October, they decided to go on a tour of the Columbia River on boats of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. The Oregon Steam Navigation Company was founded in 1860 and had become a monopoly of steamboat travel up the Columbia River, up the Snake River. If you were traveling from Portland upriver, you were on an OSN boat. That was pretty much the way that they operated. They bought out all the competition. There were other competitors, but they would buy them up and create this huge network. John Ainsworth was the president of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. And as I mentioned before, he was part of the committee that was touring the Puget Sound area because in addition to putting the rail line in, the Northern Pacific Railroad was also considering buying steamboats on Puget Sound because they wanted to continue their network of transportation. The steamboat Tenino, which was operating on the Upper Columbia, is owned by the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. In 1872, I discovered that the Northern Pacific, I didn't discover it in 1872. I discovered that in 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad had purchased 75% of the stock in the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. They owned the company. They owned the Tenino steamboat. So of course, as part of their tour, they toured the steamboat line, because just like they toured their train line, they're looking at their entire network. And in fact, this is John Ainsworth, who was the president of the company. His archives are down in Oregon, and that's where I found that bill of freight and other information about early Northern Pacific Railroad interest with the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. This is the Tenino, operating on the Upper Columbia. So during this period where they're touring, I don't have any evidence that they were actually on the steamboat Tenino, but it was operating on the same area of the river that they did tour. They did tour on the company's boats. They went to Wallula, which is one of the ports of stop for the Tenino. The stock ownership that they purchased gave them nearly all transportation facilities in Oregon and Washington Territory along the river all the way to Puget Sound. So that was one of their goals. Remember, they're trying to build a transcontinental network. And so if they can say, well, you can go all the way from Idaho on our boats, down to Kalama, get on a train, go all the way to Puget Sound, get on a boat, and go all the way to Canada. That was phenomenal for this period. So the next thing is that on October the 11th, having come, let's see. Oh, actually here, they talked about it in the Washington Standard. From Kalama to the mouth of the Snake River, 300 miles. There's good river navigation and 2 portages, which were operated by the Oregon Steam Navigation Company. So by the end of 1873, the company was projected to have 600 miles of steam communication at the end of each line. And that was their goal. So on October the 11th, they met in the OSN offices, the Steam Navigation Company offices, and Ainsworth, Thompson, and Reed, officers of OSN, made a presentation to the committee, the Pacific Committee. And the minutes then refer to the 65 miles of road between Kalama and Hodgdon's. On October 11th, they're still calling it Hodgdon's. 7 days later in the press, it's going to be Tenino. So something happens in this week, and we're closing in on that. They call it at the present northern terminus of the road. I can't imagine that they would want to continue to have to call it that all the time. So they're probably looking at this point for some way to call it. This is on the 11th of October. On the 12th, they hold another meeting, also at the OSN offices, and President Cass makes a proposal. He decides, having toured the Puget Sound, that Seattle should be the terminal. And so he proposes that they build a line from the present north end of the line to Seattle. But what he says is that he wants it to be the road between Tenino and Seattle. And this is the first use of the name Tenino that I've been able to discover. And it's used by President Cass at a meeting in Portland, Oregon on October the 12th, 1872. It is not a local name. It's created in Oregon. And it just kind of floored me that this was the use, that and it's fully spelled out. It's not an abbreviation. So this is then, from here on, it will be known by the railroad as Tenino. That's going to be their designation for their terminal, their depot, up in the Scatter Creek Valley. Another hint comes a month later, where the Washington Standard posts that this is the extension of the Northern Pacific Railroad from the old Tenino to the new town of that name. So what's the old Tenino? They're not naming it after a previous name for the area. They're trying to show you can go from one place to another. That's from the old to the new. Well, the steamboat Tenino was operating on the upper Columbia and Snake. The new town of Tenino is the end of the terminus for the line. You can go now from the old Tenino to the new. And so this quote was actually mentioned by several historians in Tenino's history. And every time they mention it, they go, huh, I don't know why. And this is why, is it's bookends of their network of steam communication. So I'll talk a little about the OSN steamboat, because this seems to be the source of the name, that the committee, having toured the network, knowing about the steamboat Tenino, which they owned, they decided to use that name as the name for their new terminal. Now, did they do it consciously for marketing, because that way they could say you can go from one Tenino to the other? Or did they just say, well, we're using a lot of Native American names, it sounds cool, and there's nowhere else named that? I don't know. There's no recorded document I could find that identifies why President Cass used Tenino in that meeting for that location. I have looked at the records of everybody at that meeting that has an extant archival record somewhere. I've checked with the archivists at those places looking for anything from 1872 to see if anybody made a note about why it was named that. And there are very few of those people that have archive records anywhere. And it's not to say that something won't turn up someday, but I was unable to find any other documentation for it. However, I feel pretty solid that this makes sense. This is the link. There is a link between the railroad coming into Coalbank, into Hodgson Station, and the Oregon Steam Navigation Company and the steamboat Tenino. So that connection is what causes it to be named. So the boat itself was built about 1860 near Celilo, and it was near the site of what was the summer village of the Tenino band that had lived there. It was heavily used on the upper Columbia and Snake Rivers in the 1860s. It held the record for having gone the farthest up the Snake River, all the way to Pittsburgh Landing in Idaho, which was part of the coal field, or not coal field, the mining fields, because they were doing a lot of mining, mineral mining, gold and silver, up in Idaho. So the name itself of the boat derives from the Native American tribe. It was built there. They named it in honor of the tribe, although the tribe itself, I'll talk about it more in depth a little later, but by the time the boat was built, the tribe had been removed to their reservation in Central Oregon. The boat itself was controlled by the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1872, when they came into the Valley of Scatter Creek, when they named Tenino. But in the panic of 1873, that stock had to be sold as part of their financial losses. So they no longer controlled the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, no longer controlled the boat. So there was no reason to talk about it as a source of name. And everybody who named it or were there when it was named, not everybody, but most people at that meeting in Portland were from back east, and they all went back east to the next meeting. The proposal, by the way, that Cass made, that the end of line be Seattle, they discussed it. It was deferred for further discussion once the committee got back to New York. And then it was decided not to go to Seattle. But that was Cass's proposal, which was shelved when it was made out here. So the steamboat itself actually struck a rock in 1876. Her engines were pulled out and put in a new hull, and it was renamed the New Tenino. They seem to like new and old Tenino a lot. According to Atkins, who was a master steamboat captain in Lewiston, Idaho, he wrote that in 1880, it was dismantled and the hull was towed to Lewiston, where it was used as a wharf boat until 1884, when in the winter an ice gorge in the Snake River tore her from the moorings and she was wrecked on an island just below the city of Lewiston. So that was the end for the steamboat Tenino. Oh, somehow I got off my track here. This is the earliest use of Tenino for the Native American band. This is from the Treaty of 1855, where it mentions two of the chiefs and the name of the band. So this is the earliest written record I could find of the use of the name. So it's generally accepted that the steamboat is named after the Tenino band. This is where then the Tenino band is identified. And one of the historians actually following up on this in the 1930s tried to inquire with the Tenino natives what the word Tenino meant, and was told by the superintendent of the Warm Springs Agency that some of the old people claim it's merely a word without meaning. It's just their name. They're just called the Tenino. So the Tenino were removed. They were living in summer and winter villages. There's some good articles about the Native American tribe. Several hundred of them living on the Columbia River. They had 5 different bands associated, and they did salmon fishing on the Columbia River, and then in the winter they would live farther inland. And so they had two main villages. They were removed in 1858 to the Warm Springs Reservation, where their descendants are currently members of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Oregon. This then is the oldest known photo of the Tenino Depot. This dates from 1876 to 1878, based on the photographer. I won't go into the history of the photo further, but this is likely not the temporary facility that was built in 1872, but rather after the line was put through in 1873 all the way to Tacoma. They then kind of formalized, if you will, their depots and upgraded their structures. And this probably dates from 1873 to 75. The Tenino Depot was important because, in part, it also was the connection to Olympia, the territorial capital. Olympia was passed over as the rail went to Tacoma, and Olympia was not happy about that. Stage connection was the only way, and there had been a stage connection for over a decade coming from Olympia down through Hodgdon Station. So they were used to it being a stage line, and the stage line continued throughout the 1870s. In 1878, Olympia finally built the Olympia to Tenino Railroad, and it actually connected at this depot so that the two lines could one line could take people to and from Olympia from Tenino, and then you could get on the Northern Pacific main line at Tenino. That is the end of my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we need to do I need to get out a shared screen to get people to chime in with their questions here? Should
I can stop that screen.
Okay.
But I can't get them back on board.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, anyway, feel free to unmute yourself. Maybe.
Can you unmute everybody?
Well, let's see if I can do that.
Just in case, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, I'm not sure how to unmute everybody. Oh, here we go.
Oh, I will share one other thing before we get too much farther here, maybe.
Okay.
I did, after this research, create a poster. Let me see if I can call it up here. Can you see that?
Oh, there, I am.
Okay. So the poster is about the naming of Tenino. This is at the Tenino Depot Museum, and it's the short version of my book. So it basically mentions the steamboat, and as it says at the top, the name comes from Native Americans to the steamboat to the depot, which then became the town and city.
All right, good. In fact, while we're waiting for somebody to ask a question, well, first let me go ahead and see if we have any hands up here. Okay, anybody want to say your name and then ask the question? You'll have to unmute yourself if you're muted. Anybody know? Okay. Well, I was going to ask you to talk about the museum in Tenino. I know you
Sure.
did a great job taking my wife and I along in the hayride last, I guess it was last summer during
It
the,
was last summer at Oregon Trail Days.
yeah, and you gave a good overview of Tenino history there. And so it was I'm pleased with your presentation. You did just as well, in fact, better here than you even did on the hayride. And
Well,
that's
thank you
great.
very much. I appreciate that very much, Don.
What about the museum itself? Oh, and
Oh, I see a hand.
Oh, Susan, yes.
I was just going to say thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I'm always trying to provide evidence and see if everybody comes to the same conclusion, because I don't have a smoking gun piece of documentation that just says, I named this place after this, you know. So it all had to be kind of puzzled together.
All right. All right. Thank you, Susan.
I hope it was convincing.
Oh, yes. Next to Susan must be
Craig.
Yeah, I'm Craig.
Hi, Craig.
Off topic just a little bit, but I think it'll be okay. I'm curious about the survey meridian that went through that area. Did that come close to Tenino, the one that they did from like Portland to Puget Sound, or do you know anything about that?
I don't. Could you tell me a little more?
Well, my daughter lived out, I guess, between Lacey and Yelm, and there's a road named Meridian there. And they say it was named Meridian because of the Meridian survey that was done from Portland to Puget Sound early in the region to figure out where it was.
Yeah, I am not. The survey I have is from the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the Willamette Meridian, which was the area here in the Northwest that was divided up into donation land claims and Homestead Act claims, that those survey lines were done by the U.S. government. And
Yeah.
I don't know when that was done or by who or how. I don't know much about that.
Okay, there's a marker on the Yelm Highway that talks about the Meridian, the Willamette Meridian going through there.
Wow.
So it's close to what's that grocery store up there? Well, it's west of the Redwind Casino a ways, a few miles.
Well, now I'm going to have to check it out.
Okay.
all right. Well, thank you, guys. Let's see, anybody else want to unmute yourself and ask a question? You might introduce who you are, because I'm having trouble figuring out the screen here. Okay.
I'm happy to answer any questions about Tenino history that anybody might have. I'll try to take a stab at it. I can't guarantee I can answer it.
You have a wonderful history program in Tenino with a museum and the school that's renovated there. Is that open at regular hours?
The Tickner School, a one-room schoolhouse we have adjacent to the Tenino Depot Museum. It's all part of our museum complex, and they're open the same hours. Right now, that's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 12 to 4.
All right, it's worth a trip. I love it down there. So
it's very fun, and we have a great facility and great people. Jessica Reeves Rush is our museum director,
yes.
And I'm just a docent. I show up and work there.
Well, like I say, you're a decent docent.
A decent docent. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Any other? Let's see. I was going to ask you something else, and then I forgot. Oh well, I forget how good my memory is. All right. Well, thank you so much for everybody attending. And like I said, we have recorded this. Any other question? Did I hear somebody's voice? Okay. All right. Well, Rich, thank you again for coming. It's been been a great time, and I think you're going to get some visitors to Tenino after this.
I hope so. Tenino has a really wonderful and varied and long history in the area. And
your book's for sale down there?
Pardon me?
Is your book for sale there?
It is. It's for sale at the museum. And then also the Tenino City website has a historians page, and I have a number of documents and books available on PDF there freely.
Great.
I just want the information to get out.
Good for you. I'm that way too. Well, good. We thank you again. We do have more virtual talks coming up. Because I am retiring from my Schmidt House job, I'm going to be moving to my home office, but we're still going to host these talks. So I'll use my fake fireplace screen as a background to to make it still look real. But anyway, we do have a couple coming up. The next virtual meeting is Wednesday, May 11th. So you might want to mark that down. It's the author and former director of the State Museum, or actually State Historical Society, Dave McAndry. And
That's
he'll
great.
be talking about his book, Captain Cook Rediscovered. It's called Voyage to the Icy Latitudes. He's not just known for the South Sea Islands in Hawaii. He's known for exploring the Arctic and the region around Alaska. So he'll be talking about that on May 11th. And then the next one after that is Wednesday, June 8th. And that'll be Sandra Crowell, who is the author and the editor and coordinator of the whole Thurston County history book that was out a couple of years ago now. But there's a second printing now that's out of that Thurston County history book called Water, Woods, and Prairies. So she will be on board with us on June 8th to cover that. Oh yeah, Rich has the copy up in front of him. So anyway, we want to thank you again. We want to thanks to the Tumwater Parks and Recreation and the Olympia Tumwater Foundation for sponsoring all this and working together. And thanks to all of you for your encouragement. We actually reached 20 participants, so we broke a record, Rich. Very good.
Very good. Thank you, Don.
Okay, but thank you all, and feel free to contact us and come and visit the brewery park at Tumwater Falls. Used to be called Tumwater Falls Park. That is really nicely done now. It's been renovated. There's a fish viewing window so you can see the salmon underwater.
I understand that your park is about to get a new sandstone piece from our carvers.
Yes,
Tenino,
absolutely.
too.
Yes, Keith Phillips has been featured on that.
Keith's our man.
He is. He's making Tenino famous too. That's great.
Yep.
All right. Well, good. Thanks again, and I'll just dismiss us with a.
Does anyone know if the Tenino Falls restaurant is going to reopen?
Oh, the Falls Terrace, you mean?
Yeah.
The Falls Terrace restaurant. We haven't heard a word on that, although it still looks like it's been renovated a little bit and modernized some of the equipment inside. So that gives me hope that they are going to open up, but we don't have any official word on that. With the COVID shutdown, they shut down too, because they need full capacity to make a profit in business. But so I'm assuming they're just waiting. I don't know. I just don't know. I better not say anything more than that because I just be assuming. So yeah, we all hope that opens up because that's a beautiful view and has always been good food, and it's a centerpiece of Tumwater also. Any other questions before we sign off? Or comments? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich. And now I'm going to go ahead and close this out and get out of here. All right, thank you. Okay.
We're in there now.
There, Ann and Howard look pretty nice on screen.
I got too white too.
Oh, I am. I'm more silver than you are.
Or more shade. That was great. Thanks a lot.
Good, thank you too. All right.
This weekend.
Okay. All right. I think I will go ahead and end it on my side too then.
Yep.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Drew and Jennifer and everybody. All right.